In recent days, there was a concerning observation from the US President Joe Biden. He warned that Putin is not joking about threats to deploy nuclear weapons in Ukraine and that the world is as close to nuclear Armageddon today as it was at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. For a closer look at Washington's response, I spoke a short time ago to Mark Watson. He's director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Washington office.
A couple of things. One is it underlines how seriously people here in Washington are taking the threat. It also raises, yet again, some questions about how exactly the White House responds to these major international and strategic issues. It was a very unusual place for the statement to be made. I mean, it was at a Democratic fundraiser, not as an address to the nation or as a statement to a press conference. So it raises yet again the question around when the president makes a statement like this, is it scripted? Is it planned? Is it just off the cuff? And if it is off the cuff, then that's a real problem. These are very serious issues. And I think it was President Macron of France that said, we really need to be very prudent when we're talking about serious issues like that. So there's a number of issues wrapped up in it, for sure.
And the reference to the Cuban Missile Crisis was interesting as well for a number of reasons, not the least of which it's about the 60th anniversary of that crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if the president's intention was to increase the deterrent effect on President Putin, there are three things that you need for effective deterrence: capability, credibility, and communication. And there's no doubt that the US has the capability, but when you get statements like this that are then walked back by the White House and by the National Security Council, it makes those last two, particularly communication, get a bit fuzzy around the edges. The reference to the Cuban Missile Crisis, if it was deliberate, could well be a reference to the fact that the way that crisis was resolved peacefully was the US agreed to give up missiles in Turkey. And was the president suggesting that here's the off-ramp, President Putin, maybe we can come to some arrangement where you get something in return for something that we in the West and the Ukraine requires? Or was it not? And this is the whole problem. People are asking this same question. Was it a significant statement, or was it just an extempore statement that really wasn't very well considered?
And in that context, we do have that broader concern, though, don't we, that with Putin under enormous pressure and having these battlefield losses, that where does he go to next? That's the fundamental question, even if we put the President Joe Biden's comments to one side.
Oh, absolutely, because President Putin's now getting pressure from the left and the right. And by that, I mean there's an anti-war movement that's obviously suppressed inside Russia, but hundreds of thousands of people seem to have voted with their feet and headed for the exits. So on the left, there is an anti-war group, but equally on the right, there are people who think the president isn't prosecuting the war with sufficient vigour. They want total war. They want total mobilisation. And it's interesting to note that when the president talked about made those Armageddon statements or comments, he also mentioned not just nuclear weapons, but also chemical and biological weapons. And this opens the possibility that maybe President Putin looks at this and says, tactical nuclear weapons is a step too far even for me, given the likely response and impact. But chemical weapons, biological weapons as weapons of terror, well, we've seen that elsewhere. We've seen it in Syria. We saw it in the First World War between, warring states there. So there is a concern that he makes a calculation that, okay, nukes are off the table, but what about these other weapons, these other, really horrific weapons that could come into play? And what would he expect the response to be from the West?